Louisa Whitby chose a really bad day to miss work. On the day that she chose to miss work was, well, together with her workmates, they had a regular habit of buying a lottery ticket. And the day she missed work was the day that they bought the winning lottery ticket. And so she didn't get a share in that winning lottery ticket. She missed out on not just a small win, her syndicate at work won £28 million. And her share of that would have been £2.5 million. But because she left work that day early, because she was meant to pay for her share of the ticket and she didn't, she missed out. Now that's a story of bad luck rather than bad decision making. How was she to know? I'm sure many people missed payments at certain times, and just a story of bad luck rather than a foolish decision. What about this one? When Brooke and I first got married, my sister gave financial advice to us. We lived in Sydney in Australia, and my sister had moved to the other side of the country to Perth, and she said, now is the time to invest in property in Perth. And at the time, the average house in Perth was about the same as about 45% of the average house in Sydney. And then within a few years, it had caught up to 100%. They were on par with each other. So if we'd got in at that right time, we would have more than doubled our money as property prices in Perth went very quickly upwards. Now, you might say, oh, you must be full of regrets at your foolish decision, David. Well, the reality is, Brooke and I had no money anyway. We couldn't have invested even if we did agree with her and think it was wise. We didn't have the money to invest, and so I don't have any regrets, actually. There's a freedom that comes from having no money because you're not worrying about where you should have invested it. Well, what about this story? That wasn't a story of regrets because I had no money to invest anyway. What about this story? In Genesis chapter 25, Esau comes in from the field hungry. He's been at work out in the field and he is starving with hunger. And his brother says to him, I will give you some of this lentil stew and some bread if you give to me your whole birthright, your inheritance. And Esau foolishly says, yes, I will swap my entire birthright, all that is coming to me, my name and my inheritance and my prominence, I will give it all to you, brother, for this bowl of, not even borscht, but lentil soup. Lentil soup he sells his birthright for. How foolish! The meal was done and dusted within a few minutes. He'd scoffed it down, and what did he have to show for it apart from a full belly? He sold his whole birthright, his inheritance, for a bowl of lentil stew. How foolish. Well, in today's kingdom story in Luke 12, Jesus wants us to see that kind of foolishness that we could fall into. And he wants us to see it for what it is, that we would say, I won't be a fool like that. Because Jesus wants us to see that only a fool grabs hold of something they can never keep instead of something they can never lose. Let me say that again. Jesus wants us to see that only a fool grabs hold of something that they can never keep instead of something that they could never lose. And it's a point that is on display throughout Luke 12. Earlier on in the chapter, the hypocrites are described as grabbing for an outward righteousness, right? They want to look impressive and they want to have this outward righteousness. But Jesus said it masks an inward corruption. And he says this in verse 2 of chapter 12. They're looking to look impressive, to hide their sinfulness on the outside. And he says, nothing is covered up that will not be revealed. Nothing is hidden that will not be known. Therefore, whatever you have said in the dark shall be heard in the light. And what you have whispered in private shall be proclaimed on the housetops. Only a fool grabs hold of something they can't keep. And he's saying to the hypocrites, you want to look impressive, but the time will come when everything you've hidden away will be publicly displayed, because nothing can be hidden from God. Only a fool would seek for this outward appearance of being righteous rather than actually being right with God. Only a fool grabs hold of something he could never keep hold of, instead of something he could never lose. And as he goes on, he speaks of this idea that you fear the crowds instead of God. You care about what people think, their opinion of you, more than what God thinks of you. And again, it falls into this category. How stupid it is that you're worried about your reputation with others instead of God, because one of those things, it doesn't last, the other lasts forever. He says in verse 4, I tell you, my friends, do not fear those who kill the body and after that have nothing more that they can do, but I will warn you whom to fear. Fear him who, after he is killed, has authority to cast into hell. And when they bring you before the synagogues and the rulers and the authorities, don't be anxious about how you should defend yourself or what you should say. Jesus warns us, don't be worried about people's opinions of you. Their opinions don't last. Instead, fear the one who judges you, God himself. His opinion is what matters. Only a fool grabs hold of something he could never keep instead of something he could never lose. And that brings us to today's parable, which we've already read. I want us to jump back into it. Verse 13 of Luke 12. Someone in the crowd said to him, Teacher, tell my brother to divide the inheritance with me. Now listen to Jesus' answer. Jesus says, Man, who made me a judge or arbitrator over you? Now is Jesus here saying, I'm not powerful enough to decide this dispute. I can't get involved in this. It's not my power to do that. Of course not. Jesus is the most powerful one. He's the judge of all. He is the arbitrator. But I think what he's pointing out here is recognize who you're speaking to. I am the judge. And what you're bringing to me is like bringing a parking fine straight to the Supreme Court. I don't want to get worried about this silly little fight. I'm going to speak about something far more important. And though that's what Jesus does. He actually doesn't arbitrate between them. They come with this problem. I love when Jesus does this, that people think this is the most important thing right now. And he says, yeah, that's not so important. I'm going to talk to you about what is really important. And so then he tells them this parable. Verse 16. The land of a rich man produced plentifully, and he thought to himself, what shall I do? For I have nowhere to store my crops. And he said, I will do this. I will tear down my barns, and I will build larger ones. And there I will store all my grain and my goods. And I will say to my soul, Soul. I love the way he just addresses himself in this story. You're doing pretty good here. You have ample goods laid up for many years. Relax, eat, drink, be merry. And then the turn. But God said to him, Fool, this night your soul is required of you. This night you're going to die. And the things you've prepared, who will they go to? Whose will they be? And so it is the one who lays up treasure for himself and is not rich toward God. Now the first thing we need to ask is, well, what does this parable teach us? But before we even ask that question, I think we need to say there's a couple of things this parable doesn't say. This parable does not say that money is evil. It didn't say that in any way, did it? He's not condemned for having lots of things. It doesn't say money is evil. And nor does it say, on the converse of that, the reverse of that poverty is somehow a good thing, that it is that we should seek to be poor. It doesn't say that. So let's not make the parable say something it doesn't say. It doesn't say money is evil. It doesn't say that somehow being poor is a more godly thing. It is possible to have lots of money and be godly. It is possible to have no money and to be ungodly. The issue isn't whether you have money or not. It's something else going on here. So that's what it doesn't say, but there are some obvious implications for what the parable does show us. It does show us that wealth is not a sign that God is blessing you. Because the man isn't given praise for having lots. Nowhere does it say, look, this was because God loved him and that he had God's favour. Doesn't mention that in the Bible. And so when we start to say wealth is a sign of God's blessing, again, we are saying something that Scripture itself does not say here. There's no hint that wealth is a sign that God is blessing you in these verses. And yet, God does want us to be rich in a certain way here. Did you notice how he says he wants us to be rich? Not with big bank accounts, not with big barns. What kind of richness does God want us to have here? A richness towards him. A richness towards him. That's what's being driven at here. So it doesn't tell us money is evil. It doesn't tell us poverty is godly. It doesn't say God's blessing you when he makes you wealthy. But it does say, be rich towards God. And so that's what we need to think about, what that means. And so if wealth in this passage is not the problem, where does this fool, that's Jesus' words, not mine, where does this fool go wrong? Why is he condemned as such a fool? You might look at the story initially, and without that last line, you might think, this sounds like a really wise guy. He has lots of stuff, and so he puts away for his future, and he has a really good retirement plan here, an early retirement. Isn't that what we all want? Stop working as soon as you can and enjoy the good life. Why is he referred to as a fool? Where does he go wrong? Well, there's two things I want to say to you that shows his foolishness. The first is this. He had forgotten that his life was not his own. He had forgotten that his life was not his possession given to him, but rather something lent to him. It does not last. He was thinking in terms of only this world, which is what our advertising slogans constantly tell us. What's Nike's slogan? Anyone know? Just do it. Just do it. And the implication is, life's short. Just do it. Whatever you can, just do it. Life's short. Play hard. I remember a t-shirt pattern, a slogan on a t-shirt when I was a child. Maybe you've heard of this one. It said this: he who dies with the most toys wins. He who dies with the most toys wins. And the message of that t-shirt was, life is a competition, and the way you win this competition is you buy yourself a boat and the fanciest car and the best computer setup and the best this and the best that, and the one who can gather together the most things, the one who was bought, who no longer has items in their wish list, but instead has them in their garage, that's the one who wins life. And maybe that's the mindset of the person, the fool in this parable, and Jesus condemns that for foolishness. Because the slogan that Jesus wants us to remember is not he who dies with the most toys wins. It is this: he who dies with the most toys still dies and takes none of them with him. And so Jesus wants this fool and the people listening in to this story about the fool to recognize this. Life is lent to us. You won't last forever. You can't take any of it with you. So that's the first problem. He had forgotten that his life was only lent to him, that he would not last, that we are born straddling the grave. Our whole life, death looms. We don't know when it will come. You don't know if you'll have a long life or a short life, but be certain of this: you won't live forever in this world, and none of the things you have now you will take with you. And this fool had forgotten that. That's the first mistake he makes. Where else does he go wrong? Well, the second one is this: he lays things up for himself, but he fails to lay things up for God. He is rich towards himself, but he does so at the expense of being rich towards God. When God does bless him, when there is this material wealth, what should have been an opportunity to be rich and generous towards God and to others, instead he thinks, this here is given for me and me alone. The world says when you have lots of things, build big fences to protect it from others. Don't let them in. But here is a picture that Jesus gives. Instead of building big fences, when you have lots, build a big table. Build a big table with lots and lots of chairs around it and invite people in. Don't fence it off and keep it to yourself. He lays things up for himself and he fails to be rich towards God. I'm a fan of Indiana Jones movies. They're so corny, they're so silly, but I enjoy them. And there's a scene in Indiana Jones and the Last Crusade where he's always chasing treasures. He's a treasure hunter. And he's chasing in this movie the treasure of treasures, apparently, the Holy Grail. And he finds the Holy Grail. But the problem with it in this, you've got to go with me in your imagination, there's a bit of magic involved in it. But this treasure cannot leave the cave. It has to stay in there. It's worthless anywhere else. And so this woman tries to take it, and she's falling down into this big abyss, and it's just out of reach. And she's reaching for it. And Indy reaches down to her and he says, "Take my hand. Take my hand." He's trying to save her. And she looks up at his hand, but then she looks down at this treasure, and she's got a decision to make. I can reach for this priceless treasure, or I can reach for the hand that's going to save me. She can't do both because they're opposite directions. And so she reaches instead for the hand, she reaches for the treasure. Now you know what comes next, it's Hollywood. So she tumbles down and it's a horrible death. But just when you think that's the end, now Indy's in the same position. He's suddenly down there. He's watched her die. He knows that if he reaches for the treasure, there's only death. And his father reaches for him. "Take my hand, Indy." This same moment. And he looks and he can't decide, and he's still reaching for the treasure. He wants the treasure, but he can't have both. You can't hold both. And eventually wisdom comes to him and he grabs his father's hand instead of the treasure. You can't hold both. You might fool yourself and think, I can do living this world's way and God's way. You can't. You can't hold both. You might think, I can be chasing after everything I want, my heart's desire, and I can be rich towards God at the same time. You can't hold both. In Matthew chapter 6, verse 24, Jesus says, "No one can serve two masters." No one. No one tried it and went, "Yeah, actually, I think Jesus got that wrong. I was pretty good at serving two masters." No one can serve two masters. For either he will hate the one and love the other, or he'll be devoted to the one and he'll despise the other, says Jesus. And then he makes it really clear what he's talking about. You cannot serve both God and money. In the King James Version, you cannot serve God and mammon. It becomes an idol for you. It grabs your heart. You can have money, but you can't grab for it and search for it and starve for it and chase after it, because you serve it and it becomes your God. It becomes your idol. It grabs hold of your heart. You cannot be rich towards God if you are chasing after this yourself. Only a fool grabs hold of something he could never keep. You cannot keep money. You cannot take it with you. And only a fool would chase after that instead of the thing he can never lose: right standing with God. So what does it mean then to be rich toward God? What does that mean for us to be rich toward God? I think we need to make sure we recognize it's more than how we use our wallets. Let's not just shrink it down to be only about our wallets. It is more than that being discussed here. In Philippians chapter 2, Paul speaks about his life being poured out like a drink offering in service of Jesus. In 2 Corinthians 5, Paul writes this about what causes this richness towards God. He says, "The love of Christ controls me." Well, the other word used there, the love of Christ compels us, because we've concluded this, that one has died, that is Jesus, and therefore all have died, that is us Christians, and he died for all, that those who live might no longer live for themselves, but for him who for their sake died and was raised. Do you understand Paul's thinking here? He says, the way you can be rich towards God, the way you can offer yourself as a drink offering, as a poured out offering, the way you can live for God is by recognizing this: Christ's love for you is amazing. It compels us. It controls our thinking. If you grip how much you are loved in Jesus, then that changes all your accounting in every other sphere of life, all your measuring of what things are worth. Everything else becomes worth so much less, so little compared to the worth of knowing Jesus. His love controls and compels us. And so that means richness towards God doesn't lead to God's favour. Richness towards God comes because of God's favour. That's really important. Being rich towards God doesn't cause him to say, you know what, I like you now. You've done enough. You've been rich enough towards me. I like you now. No, richness towards God doesn't lead to God's favour. Instead, it's the other way around. God's favour leads to richness towards God. In 2 Corinthians chapter 8, verse 9, Paul says, "For you know the grace of our Lord Jesus Christ, that though he was rich, yet for your sake he became poor, so that you, by his poverty, might become rich." How can you be rich towards God? How can you be generous towards him? It's to dwell on the gospel. The gospel isn't just the story of how you were saved. The gospel needs to control our thoughts in every way, in every part of life. You can be rich towards God because he who was rich, he who had it all in heaven, left that and came to you and swapped it for what? Not just a slightly lesser version of it. He swapped it for the cross, for pain and suffering. He who was rich became poor for you, that you might be raised up with him. And so then I ask the question, what might this kind of love look like? What might this kind of richness look like in our lives? Let's get practical here. What does it look like for us to be not hoarding it all away for ourselves, but instead rich towards God? Well, firstly, the obvious thing is it affects how we spend our money. I said this isn't all about money. I'm not trying to say it's all about money, but on the same note, money counts and how we spend our money matters. Do you see everything you have in your bank account as yours for your decision making? This is my money. I worked hard for this. It belongs to me and I'll do with it what I want to do with it. And no one's going to stop me. Is that how you think? If so, you're like the fool. You've missed that God has gifted you with all that you have. And so the way you spend your money needs to recognise that it's not yours. You had stewardship over it. God's given you decision making over it, but it is his. And so spend it with that in mind. How can you spend your money? How can I spend my money in a way that honours him and serves him rather than just myself? Be wise about it, but be generous in how you spend your money. Generous towards God and not just yourself. The second is it affects how we spend our time. If, again, you think of your life as your own, you will think, I will pursue comfort. I will do what suits me when I want to travel, when I want to have time off, when I get to do what I want with my time because it's my time. You fool. How could you think your time is your own? You belong to God. You were bought at a great price. How you spend your time matters to him. Use your time not just for yourself. Yes, take rest. Yes, do things that bring you joy, but do so with a mindset of how am I honouring God with how I spend my time? Am I being rich towards him with how I spend my time? And finally, how will you invest your life? At the end of your life, will people look at you and say, that person invested their life for Jesus? They made their life count for eternity. In Australia, there was a man, Arthur Stace, before my time. He was addicted to alcohol. He was a drunk. He was homeless, and then he encountered Jesus, the power of Jesus through the gospel being preached to him. He heard this message that God loves you so much, he sent his one and only son to save you. And Arthur Stace was changed in a moment. He was able to give up drink. He was able to turn his life around But part of what he then wanted to do was to express his thanksgiving. How do I thank God for what he has done for me? He wasn't an educated man. He was illiterate. He couldn't write. But one thing he was able to do was write the word eternity. One word, eternity, in this beautiful script. And so he spent the rest of his days with a piece of chalk just going around Sydney, in the city there, writing eternity on the pavement. Because his thinking was this: as people rush about, busy with filling their barns, busy with spending their lives on themselves, he wanted them to think about this: eternity. Eternity. That changes how you spend your money. That changes how you spend your life. Surely it changes how you respond to God. Eternity. And for us, I want to say to you this morning, how are you going to spend your life? Is it going to be big barns? Is it going to be people impressed with the garage full of toys? Is it going to be time spent building your kingdom, your popularity, your influence, your career? Or will you consider eternity and do everything in light of this? That God made you for his good pleasure. He made you to serve him. He pours blessing into your life so that you can bless others and so you can be rich towards him. Because, friends, in the light of eternity, only a fool grabs hold of something they can never keep instead of something they can never lose. Let's pray.